thanks very much. Can you all hear me? Failed scientist. Remind Jawed, next time I need to do my salary negotiations, I'm going to get you to do the talking. Right, give me a minute. I'm going to try and fire up my... which one have we got? Right. All right. Fingers crossed. Hey, right. So, I want to take you back in time. Obviously, where we are sitting in the UK at the moment, going back in time is obviously quite an attractive thing, because going forward certainly isn't that interesting, certainly not to me. Anyway, we're going to go back to Saturday, May 24th, 2008. Any of you Googling that might know what's coming next. And the location is my living room. And in the living room, gathered together are a number of what are going to become very irresponsible adults, a few too many surly teenagers, 2 cats, a home cinema system featuring a nice Yamaha amplifier and a lovely Panasonic plasma TV, and a lot of speakers that took a lot of persuasion to get in the room from my wife, an amount of food and a small quantity of wine. And the reason that we are all gathered there is this. Now, for those of you that aren't too sure what this is, the Eurovision Song Contest is a place where Europe comes together as one in living rooms across the countries and the continent to share a cultural experience that reminds us that whatever divides us, we have far more in common. Also, it's an opportunity to drink collectively, and it's an opportunity to go on Twitter and indulge in banter and hilarity. And the reason I'm bringing this up for you is that on this occasion, there's something very interesting happening with the BBC. So 2008, HD TV was very, very new, actually. The BBC had a trial high-definition channel, which will mark the one time that the Murdoch family and the BBC were friends, because the Sky TV were using the fact of the BBC HD channel to help sell Sky TV subscriptions. So they were all best mates back then. My, how the times have changed. But one of the things they were doing was doing some setup work for something that will be coming in 4 years' time, namely the Olympics. And one of the things they're doing on this particular evening is a high-definition transmission of the Eurovision Song Contest, and it's the first time that this will be shown in HD anywhere in the UK. So a bunch of us with the kit and the home cinema stuff are really quite excited to see what's going to happen. And they're also transmitting this in Dolby Digital for the first time. So what should have been going on this evening in question is that the vocals from all of the singers should have been coming out of the centre speaker. When they weren't singing, we should have been listening to the late, great Sir Terry Wogan's droll and increasingly lubricated observations. The music should have been coming out of the front left and right speakers, and venue ambience and drunken crowd singing should have been coming out of the rears. And as I had a subwoofer, there should have been plenty of bass. There was obviously the opportunity to drink really quite heavily from song 9 onwards, all in glorious HD. What we actually got was muddy vocals sounding like somebody was singing from inside a dustbin, and not much else. Cue Twitter, which was new and very shiny back then, and a conversation with some really quite stressed BBC engineers, because it becomes apparent that something has gone really quite badly wrong. And the reason was to do with the way the audio was put together. So they were actually doing something with the first versions of object-based audio that fancy AV amps could do cool things with. So live on primetime TV, the metadata telling all of the bits in really what was a very complicated transmission chain was telling all the bits of the kit what they needed to do, and what it was actually doing was, here's all the things you can do, now please ignore everything I've told you to do and do something else instead. And that was an introduction to the world of object-based media. Anyway, as you can see from the yellow line at the bottom down there, the Russians won. The UK came last and turned its back on Europe, and here we all are, 10 years later. Plus qu'à change, as Boris Johnson might possibly say. So, this is a talk about object-oriented publishing, and what it actually is, it's a thinking out loud conversation. It's been inspired by various talks and events I've attended over the last sort of 12, 18 months, and some stuff that I came to first pay attention to about 12 months ago, which is some of the work of the really very marvellous BBC R&D department. And in watching what they were getting up to, I thought there were some parallels with our industry. So I want to take you through some of the things that they've been working on, and then see the thesis of this talk is whether some of the things that are going on in our industry fit into a future world, perhaps, of object-based publishing. And because it's a keynote talk, obviously it's really exciting and really sexy, and it's a talk about workflows and infrastructure, because those are really important, sexy things that we all love. But what I'm talking about there is the workflows of the communities we serve. And there are many. So there is the researcher, there is the reader, there are the searchers, there are the data miners, there is the public, there is the policymakers, and so on and so forth. My journey, in many respects, starts here. So Kristen Rattan, who is one of the co-founders of something called the COCO Foundation. Are any of you at all familiar with the COCO Foundation? One or two. So the COCO Foundation is a not-for-profit. They have a mission to try and build what they're describing as an open platform of tools for scholarly research. Well worth looking them up on Google, having a look at what they're getting up to. Kristen's always great to listen to. There is a link there to a YouTube video from the great ALPSP conference from last year, as it happens. And this quote from her talk really stuck with me. Typically, we remove huge chunks of what was done in order to communicate through formats that we have predetermined are the appropriate formats. Thinking, yeah, that is exactly what we do. And I was thinking about that, and then I came across this quote. It's a few years old now, but this is from Tony Chirnside, who's the head of BBC R&D. And this is a guy steeped in broadcast, right? Grappling with a future that he knows is coming, where the future of broadcast media is going to change on him. The reason websites are able to respond dynamically is they're not linear video streams. They're real-time visualizations of data. Common assets are used in the visualization, but metadata exists which determines how these assets are displayed in response to the type of device asking to display them. So that gag that I did about Europe and the Eurovision Song Contest is one of their earliest experiments to try and put a workflow together and a production system together to allow them to offer different experiences based on the capabilities of people's personal kit at the other end of the chain. Let's look at this. I don't know how well you can see this, but across the top, we've got the traditional broadcasting metaphor. So you do a program and it's made in the traditional way. It's turned into a piece of linear media. So it's assembled, it's edited, it's color graded, the sound's put together and all the rest of it, and it's assembled for broadcast. That goes out to absolutely everyone, okay? And the same content, and this certainly used to be true, is played back on all devices, resulting in compromises on some of those devices. And if anybody remembers the early day of trying to get streaming media onto a mobile tablet or device, you'll remember the trouble that you had because they were shoving massively high pieces of bitrate down to your device, and the Wi-Fi couldn't cope with it, and usually the chip in the tablet couldn't cope with the amount of work that it was being asked to do. But by and large, nobody worries about those problems today. Object-based broadcasting, more or less the program's made in the same traditional way, though we'll see a bit more about that in a minute. But now it's turned into a collection of media objects along with metadata that describes how it should be assembled. And all of that's broadcast. The device, and of course this is the BBC, so it's got to be inside your home, although we'll be exploring that in a bit, okay, reassembles the media objects according to the metadata, and now it allows you to assemble those things differently, optimizing the experience and depending on local factors relating to the device environment and more. So there are some benefits that they're trying to enumerate here, and I've put them up there. So adaptation to suit the device or system. The nearest thing in our world is responsive design, and that's the most obvious one. Someone viewing content on a mobile phone is likely to want a different version of the program to someone viewing on a large screen. And actually, if you're delivering, and some of us that are in the delivery of streaming video, both live and pre-recorded, know that actually you're paying for that stuff. So if you can stream something that's adaptive to both the bit rate of the machine at the other end and actually its display characteristics, you're actually talking about monetary savings if you can set stuff up here. Adaptation to the environment. So in a lot of background noise, for example, the viewer might need to be louder in the mix. This is also known as Christmas in the UK, where someone gets themselves a nice new shiny flat screen telly and they set it up and the BBC's TV comes on for the Queen's speech or whatever it might be in the afternoon, and cue on Twitter loads of BBC have mucked up the sound mix. BBC haven't mucked up the sound mix at all. The speakers on your 1mm thick flat screen telly are absolutely terrible and they're not capable of reproducing the signal that's being broadcast to them. The BBC are actually looking at trying to identify TVs via their different sonic capabilities and provide a different mix to make that problem go away. Adaptation to suit the person. Someone might prefer a different mix between foreground or background, or perhaps you're deaf. And actually what you want for the weather report is the sign language alongside that weather. Or a viewer of the news is interested in a particular aspect of the news, and I'm going to show you an example of that, and so on and so forth. And obviously one of the holy grails is the idea of full interactivity. So the concept of object-based media is not new, actually. If you look at the world of computer games, they've been doing this for some time. In order to interact with a computer game, so Skyrim, anybody play Grand Theft Auto? Anybody got kids? Hey, brilliant, one person played Grand Theft Auto, brilliant. Keep an eye on him, obviously he's a danger to society. I've seen the number of slides he's got to go through in a minute, oof. But they have a whole complex set of mutable data allowing you to have an extremely rich and extremely personalized interaction with that particular game whilst adhering to a narrative that proceeds forward from a start to a conclusion. And from a point of view of broadcast, for example, perhaps what you want to do is to pick the space in an auditorium where you can witness a musical concert or something like that. Let's have a look at some of the examples from the BBC. So this is called Story Explorer, and it's designed to be consumed on a mobile device, and it's designed to be consumed while you are either about to watch the program or while you are actually watching the program. The program in question here is Poldark. I asked my wife what Poldark was, and she explained to me that it's a BBC period drama where an extremely attractive man runs around with his shirt off in Cornwall in the winter. I can't see what the attraction is there, but okay. But the point about this is it recognises the fact that people do not have appointment TV any longer, even though this might be a classic piece of appointment television. So you might be binge watching it, okay? You might be catching up whilst you're on the train. And the point about this is to allow you to try and remember where you are in the programme. Are you catching up after a long period of time? You've seen seasons 1 and 2, but you can't quite remember what happened. There is a domain model behind Poldark that was constructed as part of the production process for that piece of work, okay? And that allows them to tie in additional information that's keyed with particular episodes or particular scenes within episodes that allows the mobile device to supply essentially aide-memoirs as to where things have got to and where the plot has been and so on and so forth. They used to have a thing where you could go and buy episodes. I think the BBC have actually stopped that bit of the programme now because it wasn't successful, but I believe the rest of it still exists. Here's another one, and now I'm going to take my life in my hands and attempt to do a web demonstration. Right. Is your postman delivering drugs? So it was either that or Donald Trump, and I just can't cope with Donald Trump right now. Okay, so this is Newsbeat, and Newsbeat is a web prototype that works alongside Newsround. Are you all familiar with Newsround? Anybody not familiar with Newsround? Okay, right. So Newsround, BBC News, but for kids. Used very, very heavily in schools. actually. So it's a 5 or 10 minute program where they try and give you current affairs in a manner that is appropriate for kids, and they do not shy away from some of the more terrible things that happen in our world, but they do try and put that information out in an age appropriate manner. But obviously you don't have much time in a 5 or 10 minute program. So this is an attempt to expand out on that. And what you're going to see is quite simple, but underneath, remember that the workflow and the infrastructure is predicated around taking a piece of news reporting that's going to go across the BBC throughout a given day, turn that into something that's appropriate for kids, and also allow additional information to be discovered. So if we, is the mouse in the right place? Where's the mouse gone? Right, there we go. There we go. So this is the sort of thing that you might see in the actual TV report. Very sparse amounts of text because you're going to try and get through a couple of stories in 10 minutes, okay? And then if we click here, you could start to drill in. So immediately there's some extra text, but now there's a piece of video to accompany that. So if you want to drill into that further, you can do. But then you could start to understand, well, perhaps the kids aren't too sure what the Royal Mail is, and perhaps they're not too sure what the dark web is. So it's going to pull that piece of information up. Now, it's deceptively simple, what you're seeing here, but it's the yellow submarine. Interesting. Okay, not quite sure what happened there. Let's go back. But it's an example of how they've tried to bring more responsive objects into a different media for delivering information to accompany a broadcast program. And now, if I can drag this back and continue. Actually, I should have just left it there. That would have been the easiest thing to do, wouldn't it, David? Right, here's another one. And now I'm going to advance even further, actually, and I'm going to attempt to do some video. This one's great. If this doesn't work, and bearing in mind I'm trying to do this backwards, do go along to this one. CAKE, the Cook Along Kitchen Experience. It's a great acronym. The principle behind this is, right, let me get rid of the cookie notice, because I'm struggling to see the screen here. There we go, right. There we go. Right, okay. The moral of the, there we are, brilliant. Let's see if we've got any. Is he going to play the video?
Hi, my name is Bella. Welcome to my kitchen. In this programme, you can cook along with me at your own pace.
Right, lovely, Bella. Thank you very much. Right, so we are going to cook chocolate orange pots because I fancy dessert. Okay. Now, have I cooked something like this before? No, I haven't. Why are you cooking? Well, it's a very exciting time. I'm cooking for all of you. I'm throwing a party, and luckily 10 people in this room, okay, are going to be able to eat what I've cooked. And so there we are. Immediately, the first thing that's happened here is some contextual information has been gathered from me, right? How much I know about cooking, how many people I'm cooking for. It's giving me brilliant 3 litres of water, 750 grams of tofu, God knows why. Only 250 grams of dark chocolate, but there we are. We have a recipe designed for 10 people. And we're ready to go. What's happened in the background is that the program...
This is one of my favourite desserts, super indulgent and not too naughty, chocolate pots. So I have got here some 100% cacao. The beauty of this recipe is you can add your own sweetness because there's no sugar in this.
What they've done is they've understood that I'm not an experienced cook, so there are greater explanations as to all the ingredients that are being used, and there'll be a greater emphasis on explaining how to do particular things. And what I can actually do is I can read along at the same time. So yes, where I know how to break or chop chocolate into small pieces. Let's go along. There we are. And we've immediately jumped through the program.
And then I'm going to put this into my food processor.
I'm going to stop there, just because you don't really need to see somebody blending a bunch of tofu in a blender at the end of the day. But the point here is that they've taken a linear program that you might see on a traditional cooking show. They've realized that in a new world, perhaps this is not the best way of seeing these kinds of things, and they're experimenting with different ways to put together something like this that can be consumed in different ways by different people across different devices. Do take some time to go and have a look at that. I'm going to put a slide up later on that's got links to all of this stuff. Deceptively simple, but there's a lot of plumbing and a lot of complexity going on under the scenes, behind the scenes, to make that happen. And I'm going to jump to something else. I gave you a slide earlier on that listed the 4 things about benefits of object versus traditional broadcasting, and there was a 5th one, really, and that was that to remain relevant in an on-demand world where people no longer sit down and watch the telly, both the infrastructure and the workflows have to be rebuilt. And this is a journey certainly that the BBC has been going on since those times in 2008. If you want to look at some other places where it's happening, Netflix offer the interactive, it's called Puss in Book, okay, and it's based on the DreamWorks Puss in Boots from Shrek. And that's for kids, and it's a choose your own adventure video show, and it's worthwhile looking that one up. For adults, Charlie Brooker is working on something suitably challenging for an interactive episode of Black Mirror that I believe is coming up in the next series of that. And I wanted to do one more piece of video that hopefully is up there, and then we'll leave this stuff behind, which is where the BBC thinks their 2022 audience will be. Now, you're about to see one of those visions of the future type videos, and you might think it's a bit twee. But I think there's a thing to pay attention to here, is the thinking behind how they believe their audience might be consuming and wanting to consume one of their flagship properties. So, fingers crossed.
Guys, Kate's here. Hi.
So this is 2 in the
Wow,
park.
look at the crowd. Oh my god. Smile. You're on the screen. I wonder who else is watching. I know, it's so cool. I love it.
And I find that interesting because that shows a world where everything that's happened has been completely decoupled from the big rectangular box that sits in your living room or anywhere else. And it recognizes that whatever the mode of consumption is, the broadcast, the traditional broadcast to a specific location has fundamentally changed, because the metaphors by which people interact with information of whatever sort have fundamentally been changed. And that's why the BBC is spending their time trying to build this new infrastructure of an object-based approach. Right. There we go. So object-based publishing requires a number of things, and actually this is where we're in a good place, right? Because they're very common in the world of scholarly publishing. So you need very rich metadata, and we've got that in spades. You need domain models, and you need those domain models of various granularities to connect the components together, and some of us in the room have been playing around at building domain models for particular things that we do. You need the ontologies underneath that to enable the compute to occur to glue things together like you just saw in that video, and you need algorithms and AI to make use of this data in interesting ways, and an infrastructure and a workflow to enable all of this stuff to happen. So let's take a look at what in scholarly publishing might fit into this idea of object-based publishing. Does anybody know about protocols.io? Few of you do, many of you don't. So methods, Jim, but not as we know it. So the methods is that terrible bit of any research paper. If it's a Nature paper, what that says is refer to our previous paper, refer to our previous paper, refer to our previous paper, and somewhere about 8 to 10 papers back, you might actually find the method that they were talking about. Terrible, absolutely useless. This is an attempt to allow individual researchers, or indeed lab groups, to put together a more declarative method of how they actually do things. It can evolve. It can have video attached to it. It can have notes attached to it. It can even have other people come in and make observations about whether improvements could be made. You can get a DOI to a given version of a method, which means that you can link to that in a paper, okay? There is an API available, so you don't even need to go and visit the site. Nobody's really using that capability at the moment that I know of, but it does exist, and you could do interesting things with it. And actually, if you found something useful in a paper that's got a protocols method, you could go to the site, you can fork in the computer term. So take a version of that method, bring it into your own personal workspace or laboratory environment, capture that, work on it for whatever piece of research that you're doing, and not only do you have a new version that goes forward, but a link is retained to the previous version of that method. So you've got a chain of progress on something as simple as a method. It's an absolutely brilliant piece of thinking and a brilliant idea. Do go and take a look. This is another one. This is the Jupyter Notebook. I know some of you, perhaps many of you know about the Jupyter Notebook, but a document that allows you to run code alongside the text and other elements that you might expect in a human-readable document. And here's an example. So this is the traditional version on a publishing platform. Okay, it's great. Everybody's going to come to that. They're going to click on the PDF and off they're going to go. But then this is the same version done in a Jupyter Notebook, so that you can run the code that's actually referenced in the other version inside this Jupyter Notebook. And actually, at this point, I'd like to shout out to some former colleagues. So Phil, where are Cabby? Yeah, you're over there in the corner. Say hi to them. There they are, over there. So back in the day, I was at the start of something called Cabby Plantwise, which is a big project to bring plant doctors to the developing world. It's brilliant to see it go from strength to strength. I've put this up because one of my former colleagues tweeted this picture from Kenya, I think it was, a couple of weeks ago. So this is someone using a Jupyter Notebook in action. Now, what you've got here on the left, I believe, is plant doctors sitting down trying to understand what's going on. So they are going to be literally going out into the field and helping subsistence level farmers have better productivity. The person demonstrating there has taken satellite remote sensing data, has allied it to the ground truth that the Plantwise project brings in terms of where plant pests and plant diseases are, and they have built a pest prediction tool. Now, up until now, these things have been great, but completely impractical to use in the wild, as it were. Now, this is connected to Telegram, I think it is. Yep. So there's a bot on the Telegram messaging app, and the plant doctors will basically get a translation of all of that data coming from satellites in geostationary orbit, okay, down to be on the lookout for this pest because the conditions might be right, or we have evidence, other evidence of disease in the area, and therefore you should go take a look. And if something's breaking out, that's the advice you should be giving to those subsistence farmers as how to handle it. It's absolutely awesome, and everybody that worked on that is to be commended. Here's another approach to distributing code. So first of all, the traditional version in your default PDF format. And then this, you can't see that clearly, but this is CodeOcean. So CodeOcean won the ALPSP Innovation Award in September, and rightly so. What you've got here is a browser-based environment where the code that underpins that paper can be run and manipulated and inspected and checked and taken on and worked on further. And the genius behind this, as anybody knows, I know there was a comment about open source, but the tradition behind open source is, right, get your open source application, download it onto your environment, wait 3 months while you iron out all the bugs to get the damn thing to run, and then finally you can actually try and do a bit of work with it. CodeOcean says, no, we're going to wrap all of that stuff up in something called a container, and you will just be able to run what the original researchers did. So you can get on with the business of doing science, or you could get on with the business of checking whether the science that has been done has been any good. This is going to be absolutely brilliant for replication and reproducibility. Scylla. Allegedly, Scylla is a more user-friendly version of Jupyter Notebooks. It's more useful for people who aren't code geeks. I'm not entirely sure that's true when I look at that picture, but there we go. And then a personal favorite of mine, Hypothesis. Is everybody familiar with? Who's not familiar with Hypothesis? Anybody not? No, one or two people. Right, so Hypothesis, annotation for the web. Now, when I first saw this, I was like, oh, marginalia, great. Brilliant for those people that care about marginalia, and a complete waste of time for any of the rest of us that have got to get on with stuff. No, it's not. This allows you to make permanent, persistent notes about the stuff you see on the web. It's a layer that operates above the things that you visit and stays with you. And you can build groups with it. You can make public groups. You can make private groups. There's a group out there. If you get a chance to see Heather from Hypothesis talking about this, please do take advantage of that. She talks about a group that are publicly sitting there working on climate science. So whenever a piece comes out in the mainstream media about climate science, and you can all imagine what that looks like, they go in with the facts so that they can counter and explain and bring clarity and clear up misperceptions, okay? And it acts as a layer above, say, the Daily Mail, just to pick a completely random newspaper website out of the ether. Fantastic stuff, absolutely brilliant. And let us not forget Figshare, upload files, upload your data, get DOIs, Data Dryad, very similar. I think they're a bit crude because the cynic in me says, great, you've uploaded an Excel spreadsheet, so someone could get an Excel spreadsheet. Number of researchers that have got a properly formatted, properly documented, understandable Excel spreadsheet is 0. So how useful it is in practice, I don't know, but it's a start, okay? And the other one, Overleaf, which is browser-based collaborative document authoring, which again, I think is very, very fascinating when we look at workflow and infrastructure. So, object-oriented publishing, sorted. Not really. Those examples obviously are a far more sophisticated way to output research. But if you've got a paper featuring a method, code, computable outputs, and so on and so forth, okay, you've still got to go to multiple locations to consume all of the things that I've just highlighted. Each aspect of that output exists in isolation at the moment. There's no connecting metadata or even a data model, even though the primitives of those things already exist in many fields. And there's a heavy focus on computing, both literally, the examples I've shown, and sort of philosophically. If you're not a computer geek, it's hard to translate how these things might be applicable to you, which is why I like the Plantwise example so much, actually, because there's a direct connection between a problem on the ground that affects billions of people on this planet and the technologies at play right now. And the other thing about this is, did I mention the publishing platforms? Anybody here from a publishing platform? Right, close your ears. They're terrible, right? They're just not geared up for this. right? We're trying to jam stuff into these platforms, and fundamentally, the metaphors, the architecture, absolutely everything isn't there. Fundamentally, it's all co-located around a model of information output that in its guts is still based on the concept of a letter written to an organization that will publish it in a collection of other letters called a journal. Even that newfangled and scary looking preprint server idea still hews to the idea of a print artifact. It's right there in the header. And in a world of research and its outputs that is objects-based feels a bit closer to me and potentially just around the corner. So let's jump ahead a little bit. Well, actually, we're going to go back in time first. Right, so this is a story of a wee company that started out in the online books business, okay? They're called Amazon. You may have heard of them. And 12 years ago, they decided to monetize their waste product. And in this case, it was spare compute. So it was compute, storage, and networking. And that's the stuff there outlined in that little red box. And it was called Amazon Web Services. Roll on 12 years, and this is the offering today. It's already out of date because they keep offering everything, enhancing it every few weeks. But basically, you've got the primitives of all of today's technology, and they're offering them up to users, and you can go in at any level. So you can go in at infrastructure. If you take an idea like, where are we? AI, okay? If you think you've got a really sophisticated proprietary AI algorithm and you just want the tin, the metal, the hardware to run it on, you can go there. No capex, just rent it. Perhaps, though, that you want to go up. You want to use some of the machine learning tools that already exist, such as TensorFlow and other ones. You can go in there. Or perhaps actually you want to go in at a much higher level and you go, you know what I need? I need to do a bit of image recognition, or I need to do a bit of text-to-speech recognition. All of those things are services offered to you on a pay-as-you-go basis, and that's just one example. Everything in there is connected by an API, and all of those APIs talk not only to each other, up and down the stack, but they could talk left and right as well. So there's an offering for every level of innovation and consumption, and it gets away with the zero value add complexity of setting these things up. The BBC are doing something similar with their digital object-based and semantically connected information. If you were attending tech conferences a few years ago, perhaps you will remember the time when everybody jumped up and down, and their semantics example was the BBC's Olympics, because it was an object lesson, pardon the pun, in how to do it right. I think we should be thinking about doing the same things, because somewhere in a future talk, there's a future scholarly digital services slide, right, where there's a generated on-demand PDF for the layperson, or it's a PDF for the expert, or the person that just needs a summary, or a policymaker, or maybe it's Alexa or another voice-activated interface coming in, consuming these things and giving you information while you're sitting there eating your cornflakes in the morning. And then there are services for those who really want to dig in to the global scholarly research output, to do better peer review with tools built of the platform, to assemble better research output objects, to share, or in cases not to share, data as appropriate, the work that underpins the thinking. Because although everybody just wants the PDF, it seems that a great many stakeholders across the piece want a lot more, and the linear, inflexible endpoint that is an article needs to evolve. But of course, with that is a further challenge. The AWS slide, as any of us know that play in the cloud, is more than just a list of services. It's a portent of what can happen in an object-based, service-based environment. So as the Scotsman playing a Spaniard says to the Frenchman playing a Scot, there can be only one. I'm not going to do the accent, you're all right. But judging by some of the recent acquisitions made by some of the big players, some of whom are in this room, and some of the recent announcements made by funders, both state funders and private funders, we must face up to the challenge of figuring out whether the ecosystem that's starting to emerge will end up in the control of a few very large players, perhaps only one or two, as you could see with Amazon and Microsoft, right? Or whether a more rich, diverse ecosystem of scholarly objects will come to be in a more open environment. And on that note, thank you very much, and hopefully I've got time for questions. There's my slide link. If anybody needs a copy of that, I can give you that later.
I think we have some questions.
Anyone?
Yeah, any questions? Means it is always interesting to hear Dr. Smith, and I think today as well, it was quite interesting, and we learned quite a bit. So if there are any questions for Dr. Smith.
Terrified you all into silence. Yeah.
So I find the BBC video worrying because it's like people not really coaching people not real experiences of things. It's like sort of simulacrum, like rehearsal and that. So everything like that sort of real experience. So it really scares me when I see that competition.
Yes. Oh, no, that's not I won't go back there. I'm not allowed. It's the big signs here that says "Do not touch these microphones." So I shall do as I'm told, which my colleagues will know will be a first. Yes, I think that's a very good point. There's a much bigger conversation there, isn't there, about the way that we are consuming information and how we are consuming information. I think the one thing I would say about that is it's clear to me at least that certainly in the R&D department of the BBC, they're understanding that if you can't get the opportunities out to people to dig in deeper into information, then that's one of the key problems. So they're at least trying to solve that problem. I think the other thing about that, and I'm watching my son at the moment who hangs out with his mates on his Xbox. And he's doing all the things that pre-teens do, only they're all located, I think they're all pretty much in the UK at the moment. Most of them he's never met, right? But there's quite a rich conversational interaction going on there. And I think one of the things that your point speaks to is the nature of how do we get our information to the right people at the right time in the context where we can use it. And I think the one thing I'm pretty clear on, as hopefully you've understood from my argument here, is that a long linear paper in whatever archaic format any of us are currently publishing it is probably not the optimal way to do it. But there are a great many challenges, and there's a great many challenges in funding how to make this happen as well, candidly. Anybody else? Got one and then two. Go on.
Just reflecting on that new technology, and for example, the BBC, it was children who were adopting it. Do you see the adoption coming from people new who haven't previously picked up a past way of working and using the new technology? Or do you see people who are currently working embracing the change and the new capabilities enabled by things like Jupyter and so forth?
Probably both. I think that in the scholarly world, change comes slow, and change comes slow because of the success and incentive schemes that get successful researchers to the top of their particular trees and the funding. So that's an interesting aspect of our particular world. There's a slide that I've got from another talk that I've given that actually has some great work. I think it was done by Nielsen on consumption of media. And if you're in the broadcast or the newspaper or that kind of media business, those numbers are absolutely devastating for you when you look at cohorts by age. Because younger people, only they're not so young now because even our millennials are in their mid to late 20s, okay, those folk are not buying TVs, okay? They're buying mobile phones, so everything's consumed. They don't have a place to live, right? Not in the same way as we did. So all the metaphors about how they consume information is fundamentally changing. And if you look at the cohort, there's a group of sort of 50 to 70, right? Sit at home, still watch the telly, still watch the next 6 o'clock news, those things haven't changed. But the younger population simply is not interacting with any of that stuff in that way at all. There's we just started Doctor Who, right? There's a whole thing about the overnight ratings, which is a complete joke, right? Because most of the people watching Doctor Who are not watching it on a TV set at 6:50 or whenever it is on a Sunday night. They're watching it on their mobile phone on their way into school or on their commute. That's how that's happening. Completely different method of consumption. So I think that's the key issue that certainly the BBC are facing. And if any of you have read Alan Rusberger's excellent book, Breaking the News, which he's just published, you can see The Guardian dealing with those issues as well. Our world is a little bit different, but I still think change is going to come. Yeah. And then...
Yeah, so I think, from what everything you've spoken about, all of this requires significant investment.
Yes, it does.
You can see a big change with publishing, scholarly licensing going forward. And actually, only a small, as you said, there's only a small number of large players left in the market. Is there any way you think that's avoidable? Like, is there any way?
So the thing that I always come back to is if I look at Orchid, so that's where publishers collectively have come together to enable a not-for-profit organisation to do a piece of infrastructural work that is essentially, you could almost argue, well actually I'm not almost, you think, well we should argue that it's a public good, right? So again, could you argue that publishers collectively could support Hypothesis? I think that's a far more attractive model than, dare I say, Elsevier or Wiley or Springer Nature. I can't think why I used the words Elsevier straight off the bat there. But actually dipping into your pots of reserves and buying these companies, right? Don't get me wrong. I know some people get upset when you do that stuff. I'm not one of those people because it's business. The question is, in the round, is that aggregation healthy? And again, you could extend that argument out to the funding agencies. Obviously, right now, a bunch of us are dealing with the interesting stuff around Plan S. And I look at that and I think there's a bunch of funding agencies actually not really engaging with what the real issues are, because you are not going to fund these kinds of exciting things and the work needed to make this sort of stuff happen in a Plan S world, because the money simply isn't there to enable it to happen. And that's nothing to do with whether we like OA or not OA. Anybody else? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, and I don't know who's next.